Okay, well, welcome. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Billy Junker, and I'm the current Director of Graduate Study for the Department of Catholic Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the annual Catholic Thought and Culture Lecture. The annual Catholic Thought and Culture Lecture came into being roughly 2 decades or more ago. Its aim was to highlight the work and thinking of professors who regularly teach in our master's program and provide an intellectually stimulating venue for returning alumni of the program, current students, undergraduates, and friends of Catholic studies and the humanities more broadly speaking. I'd like to thank, first of all, Shauna Wicker for organizing this event, and I'd like to also thank Karen Laird for advertising it extremely well, because all of the seats are pretty much taken. I'd also like to thank all the staff at St. Thomas for helping us run it, so everyone please give them a hand right at the beginning here. And this year for the annual lecture, we are privileged to host as our speaker Dr. Raymond Mackenzie. Dr. Mackenzie, it's fine, he deserves applause. Dr. Mackenzie is professor of English at the University of St. Thomas and is the current editor of the Center for Catholic Studies home journal, Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture. Dr. Mackenzie is a remarkable scholar with impressive range. He has written on Milton's poetry, on Christina Rossetti's hair, and on business ethics language, and on many other things besides. More than this, Dr. Mackenzie has emerged over the last decade and a half as one of the most important and prolific, and in my opinion, certainly the most indefatigable, translator of French literary classics working today. He has translated and introduced works of the great poet Baudelaire, the novelists Mauriac, Flaubert, Zola, Balzac, and Stendhal, and the political philosopher Montesquieu. Here again, I would like to note Mackenzie's impressive intellectual range. However outstanding Dr. Mackenzie's scholarship, his real claim to fame, at least in Catholic studies, is the Catholic novel course he regularly teaches in our graduate program. Centered around Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and including other works by Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Mauriac, Flannery O'Connor, Willa Cather, and others, the Catholic novel course is a highlight of our students' time here, with many of them listing it as their favorite course. It is therefore with no small amount of appreciation and excitement that I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Ray Mackenzie, scholar, editor, translator, and teacher extraordinaire. His lecture for us tonight is entitled, Lending Our Minds Out, Literature and Catholic Vision.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Junker. How's my volume? Is that all right? When Dr. Junker invited me to speak here as part of the Catholic Thought and Culture lecture series, I thought it'd be a good opportunity for me to think about the role of literature in the formation of a Catholic mind and soul. And I mean not just formation during the student years, but for our ongoing formation. Okay? I've been reading and studying serious literature since I was a teenager when I got hooked on it, and I've been teaching it for over 30 years. So I wanted to use this lecture as an opportunity to think through for myself and try to answer the simple question, what is literature for? What's the good of it? Why? Okay? Why does literature matter? And almost immediately upon posing that question, I remembered a phrase from a poem by Robert Browning. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. There's the culprit. Okay. Browning, some of you know, I'm sure, Browning's best poems are monologues, where characters from history or from fiction are placed in a situation that forces them to talk. Okay? And in talking about themselves, they reveal quite a lot, sometimes things they hadn't meant to reveal. He has monologues spoken by bishops and monks, by murderers and madmen, but one of the best is spoken by a real historical figure, the Renaissance-era painter, Fra Lippo Lippi, who I'm afraid Browning actually pronounced as Lippo Lippi. And there he is. And there's a self-portrait, and a somewhat humorous one. Our painter looks like he doesn't know quite what he's doing in his painting. But he was not primarily a humorist. Here's one of his very fine pieces, a Madonna with the child and little angels. I've always been taken by the face of that little angel in the foreground in particular. It's like a little Italian street kid. The painter was a Carmelite monk in 15th century Florence. He'd been an orphan and was taken in by the Carmelites, but as he grew up, his innate talents as a painter started to show. The boy himself, however, was notoriously undisciplined, and in Browning's poem about him, we find him, he sneaked out of the monastery in the middle of the night, off to engage in some very unmonkish behavior in town, when he's stopped by the watch and has to explain himself, being out after curfew. In the explanation, he goes into many issues, including matters of art and what art is for. Okay? He asks at one point in the poem, what's it all about? Should the things of this world be simply ignored, passed over, okay? Or should they rather be dwelt upon and wondered at? Okay? Our art, he concludes, ought to instead reproduce faithfully the world that God has made. And he goes on to say, for don't you see, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we've passed perhaps 100 times, nor cared to see. And so they are better painted, better to us, which is the same thing. He goes on to say, art was made for that. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out. Now, in this context, the painter is referring to faces, the point being that we see faces around us all the time. I don't think much about it, but sometimes when we see one painted, okay, in a canvas or on a fresco, we can't help but be struck by it, sometimes even fascinated by it. We experience, in such moments, a sense of wonder at the human face, its uniqueness, its expressiveness, its beauty. Okay? The painting helps us to see the sheer wonder that there is in the ordinary things around us. Now that last phrase, lending our minds out, okay, has always struck me. Artists lend their minds out, helping us to see the way they see, think the way they think, and as Filippo Lippi says, this is not a trivial thing. God uses us that way, he says, to help each other so, to help each other see. Browning's character in the poem is a painter, a visual artist, but it strikes me that the point is even more relevant to literary art. Most of us take reading for granted, but when we think about it, the fact that words in black type on a white piece of paper can make us feel as if we're on an ancient Greek battlefield or in a 19th century whaling boat. That's a strange thing and a wondrous thing about the human being and the human mind. So let me move away from visual art and into literature a little bit. And I want to explore a simple point tonight, that this study of serious literature helps us see better. Okay? That the Catholic reader, I think, benefits from this improved vision, or maybe benefits in a different way, more dramatically than would a non-believer. Okay? And let me explain what sort of vision I'm talking about. The painter Filippo used the word pretty literally. A painting helps us see, okay, and thus pay attention to faces and things we might ignore. And of course, we use the word see in all kinds of different ways, many of them metaphorical. Okay? When I say I see what you mean, okay, I'm using the word as a metaphor for understanding, right? And we've built words to indicate that metaphorical meaning of see, words like insight and foresight. Okay? I want to use the word vision and seeing tonight in a mixed way, sometimes literal, having to do with what we actually see with our eyes, but sometimes metaphorical. And I'm going to be using the term in the way that St. Augustine used it when he described what he called 3 modes of vision. There. Okay. In his book on the literal meaning of Genesis, Augustine develops this idea. The 3 modes of vision, as you see, and they're in kind of a hierarchy. Corporeal, then spiritual, I've got that in quotation marks, which I'll explain in a moment, and 3 intellectual. 3 kinds of vision. Corporeal or bodily vision is pretty much what the phrase implies. We see with our eyes. This is how we see objects in the material world, the way I see you out there, the way I see this lectern. Corporeal vision, biologically speaking, is pretty complicated and complex and marvelous itself. But to us, most of the time, it seems pretty simple and pretty obvious. There's a wonderful line in the poet Wordsworth where he says, the eye, it cannot choose but see. You know? And you just open your eyes and you're seeing. Corporeal vision is that automatic for us. Okay? The next level of vision, though, is what Augustine called spiritual, but it's a very unusual use of that word spiritual. It doesn't mean anything like the way we would usually use the term today. When he uses the word, he's using the word spirit to designate, I quote, a power of the soul inferior to the mind, wherein likenesses of corporeal objects are produced. So if someone mentions, for instance, the President of the United States, I can see him, in a sense, in my mind's eye. That phrase comes from Shakespeare's Hamlet, the mind's eye. I see him there, but obviously not in a corporeal sense, right? This is in what Augustine is calling the spiritual sense. I sometimes think a better term for this would have been something like imagination or the imaging faculty. But Augustine wants to use the word in this special way. He spends a couple of chapters explaining why he uses the word this way, and the explanation only makes it worse. So I won't go into that. Well, with this spiritual vision, I can generate an image of the object that's being referred to. Corporeal vision may have originally given me a picture of the president, if I've seen a photo or whatever, but it does nothing more than provide, or as Augustine puts it, announce, the presence of an object to the spiritual sense. It remains available to me even if I'm not corporeally seeing it through spiritual vision. But the highest, most powerful, and most nearly perfect mode of vision is what he calls intellectual vision. With intellectual vision, we now understand, or to use that phrase I used before, I see what you mean. I see in that sense. I understand. Total understanding is possible with intellectual vision. So in this mode, vision is being used almost entirely metaphorically, right? Figuratively. But this kind of seeing is the most important kind. Intellectual vision includes what we would call insight and what we would call intuition. With intellectual vision, we see or understand complex concepts like the virtues, like truth, like love. So we use the term vision in lots of ways, including the way it's used by the saints and the mystics, right? The mystical experience that we call visions, those too belong to intellectual vision. Sometimes what the visionary sees cannot be put into words. This is the experience that Paul speaks of in 2 Corinthians when he talks about having been wrapped up to the third heaven. Augustine spends a lot of time on that passage in Corinthians and argues that the third heaven Paul is talking about is another way of naming this third kind of vision. And Augustine goes on to conclude that this intellectual vision, quote, is superior to every corporeal vision by which bodies are perceived through the senses, and superior also to all spiritual vision by which the likenesses of bodies are beheld not by the mind but by the spirit. For in this vision, this intellectual vision, the brightness of God is seen by those whose hearts are purified for the vision. So this intellectual vision it transcends sense perception. It also transcends the working of the imagination, the imaging faculty, which is kind of what the second version it refers to. Now, there's a kind of hierarchy even within the category of intellectual vision, because only very few of us are going to experience that third heaven that Paul came to, or see the kinds of things that St. Teresa did. But all of us are capable of understanding with intellectual vision the virtues. We're capable of grasping complex ideas that transcend sense data. So let me turn to literature a little more specifically, because I think Augustine's 3 modes of vision can help us understand what happens when we read serious, powerful literature, when authors lend their minds out, to us. Of these three modes of vision, I suppose the second, the so-called spiritual vision, is the one we'd first think of when we think of reading, right? We pick up a novel and we develop mental images of the characters we meet, the places they go, the actions they perform. Sometimes our images might be based on people we've seen or places we've been with our corporeal vision, right? But we also form images of things we've never seen, as we do with, say, Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. He has us picturing battles involving orcs and elves and dwarves and all sorts of creatures that we have never literally seen, corporeally seen. So this second spiritual mode of vision is a powerful ability that we humans have. And literature is well positioned to draw upon it and exercise it. But it doesn't involve the understanding. Okay? This is where intellectual vision comes in. With intellectual vision, we transform that battle between orcs and elves into a metaphor for the struggle between good and evil. Augustine reminds us of the story in Genesis of Pharaoh's dream. You remember? When Pharaoh was puzzled by this mysterious dream he had of 7 ears of corn and 7 cattle. Okay? Pharaoh saw them, right, in his dream by means of spiritual vision. Okay? But he didn't know what the images meant. Okay? And Joseph came along to interpret them for him, so that the story becomes an illustration of the difference between spiritual and intellectual vision. Okay? Pharaoh sees with spiritual vision in his dream, but Joseph sees with intellectual vision. Joseph sees better than Pharaoh. An author who thought a lot about literature making us see better, to come much closer to the modern era, is the French novelist Gustave Flaubert. There he is. He of the great mustaches. I've had the honor and pleasure of translating 2 of his novels. And as I work with his prose line by line, trying to find an English equivalent for what his French is doing, I've become increasingly impressed by the depth of his thinking on all this. He wrote a lot about writing. While he was working on his first great novel, Madame Bovary, over a period of several years, he'd work all morning and afternoon on the drafts, revising and perfecting the prose, and then relax late in the evening by writing about what he did during the day to correspondence. Yeah? And those letters of his are marvelous. They tell us a great deal about the craft of the novelist, but they also reveal an obsession of his about the uniqueness of a good writer's style. This first novel of his, Madame Bovary, I know many of you have read, 1857, was about an extremely unglamorous, unromantic subject matter. And it was set in an extremely unglamorous set of people. But it's a novel that has deeply affected millions of readers since its publication, 1857. But the subject matter of a book, Flaubert argued, almost doesn't matter. He says, there is no such thing as an elevated style or a degraded subject, he wrote in one of his letters, these late-night letters of his. He went on to say, one could almost set it up as an axiom that from the point of view of art, of pure art, there is no subject. Style being in itself an absolute way of seeing things. The statement seems almost paradoxical, doesn't it? Of course, a work of art has a subject, okay? And of course the subject matters. We all want to object immediately. But if we take a little closer look at the idea, we should ask what style means in this context. When Flaubert calls it an absolute way of seeing things, he's suggesting that style is unique in each instance, that each artist sees differently, and that the style is the expression or concretization of that vision. What would bad style be then? Okay? Or inept style, or inartistic style? What would that be like? Well, Flaubert answers, it would be a style dominated by cliché, by prefabricated phrases and conventional views. It's just here that Flaubert becomes very decidedly anti-modern, because for him, the dominance of the cliché, the accepted view, the standard way of saying things, the standard way of seeing things, he sees as a hallmark of modernity, of the world we live in. Okay? Cliches like this, he says, do our thinking for us, just as they do our seeing for us. They negate our unique individual vision, and they turn our art into something readily mass-producible, into commodity. Okay? They deaden our perceptions. Okay? And worse yet, many readers tend to welcome this deadening, okay? Because it's easier not to have to think. Perhaps because it's easier to repress, for instance, spirituality and just see a purely ordinary world in front of us. To ignore the beautiful, for example. Yeah? Easier. Flaubert waged kind of a lifelong war on that kind of non-thinking, the kind of thinking that cliché and formulaic writing promote in us. Okay? That deadening is a theme that he addresses in many of his works and in those famous late-night letters he wrote. Okay? Madame Bovary includes a number of characters who can't think without ready-made phrases. They just spout cliches endlessly. Okay? And they're not very admirable people as a result, living not very admirable lives. Okay? Late in his life, Flaubert did a mocking book called The Dictionary of Accepted Ideas, where you could look up exactly what you ought to say on any given topic, exactly what it said. Okay? So you don't have to actually think about it. Okay? There's always language, always something ready to come in and take care of your thinking for you. His novels are rich in satire on characters who can reel off inane cliches at the slightest whim, government officials and politicians, but the disease of non-thinking is not limited to them. Right? It infects all levels of society, and it encourages in us a bland acceptance of the way things are. He saw the rise of mass communication as especially inimical in this respect. Such writing deadens the mind and helps to weaken and reduce our own humanity. The human person becomes little more than a consumer, a unit in a mass of units, afloat in a tide of comfortable, familiar phrases and stories. But literature, Flaubert insists, ought to be doing just the opposite. Literature ought to be helping us to see the world in all its complexities in a new, fresh, and challenging manner. That is to say, literature ought to be helping us become more human instead of less, become that creature who's blessed with the capacity of what Augustine called intellectual vision. Right? Flaubert is by no means the only writer urging us to reclaim our individual agency, our richest and deepest capabilities. But in his case, he puts a lot of emphasis on style, on the difference between the cliché, the ready-made phrase, okay, and true individual style. And that individual style, remember, is an absolute way of seeing things, he says. Considered this way, the issue of style, as Flaubert sees it, is not simply an issue of interest to writers, but to all of us. Okay? Modern culture is always rushing in, coming between us and the world, proffering new things to buy, new forms of entertainment, all of which are ways to avoid seeing what's right in front of us, to avoid thinking about it, to avoid a meaningful life. Style, as Flaubert conceives it then, is not trivial. It's a way of resisting the gravitational pull of modern culture and its numbing of the mind. The uniqueness of a particular writer's style helps us break through our habitual daily view of the life around us. Or, to use a term that literary critics have been using a lot, literature serves to defamiliarize the world around us. It's a good term, I like it. The term was coined by a Russian critic named Shklovsky. Easier to spell than to say. Shklovsky says, I'm going to quote him here, that art exists so that one may discover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar to us so that we see them afresh. So Shklovsky's idea of art as defamiliarization is another way of saying that art and literature try to make us see again. So when a Flaubert novel helps us break through that shell of habit. Okay? He's done what Browning's painter, Filippo Lippi, said. He's lent his mind out to help us. The French Thomist philosopher Jacques Maritain sees something similar, but from a slightly different angle. Maritain starts from Thomas Aquinas' claim that beauty causes the pleasure we feel in seeing something that is well proportioned. Maritain sees this as an encounter of the human intellect with another intellect that is signified in the beautiful thing. Okay? When the light of your mind falls upon something beautiful, it brings into act the light of another mind, not the mind of the artist, but of the creator, okay, who is beauty. Beauty is a transcendental. Right? And the moment one touches a transcendental, one touches being itself, a likeness of God, an absolute, that which ennobles and delights our life. So Maritain says. So we remember Robert Browning's formulation I had up here a minute ago. God uses us to help each other, so lending our minds out. The role of beauty and its communication through art, through sharing the mind of the artist, is also emphasized in John Paul II's letter to artists. He says there that, quote, the artist's image in the network, the artist's image in the artwork allows us to inhabit his way of seeing. It allows us even to assent to such a way of seeing as good without resolving whether what is seen is real. Okay? Lending our minds out. This lending our minds out then is a kind of fellowship afforded us by art, by literary art, and by language itself. Okay? We learn via language, don't we? And the desire to know in Augustine's formulation is a kind of love. Okay? For Augustine, language is sharing our perceptions. He goes on to say that human fellowship mutually communicates its own perceptions, lest the assemblies of men should actually be worse than utter solitude if they were not able to mingle their thoughts by conversing together. This is what language is for. External language, then, he says, is given us so that we may share our inner worlds, our thoughts and feelings with our fellows. The literary artist goes a step further, not just sharing his or her thoughts with us, but through representations of characters, places, actions, allows us to share his or her unique view of the world, or, as John Paul said, to inhabit his way of seeing. I think it's important to remember that, in fact, each of us has a unique view, because each of us is unique. You're all familiar, I think, with the frequently quoted statement by Benedict. Right? The purpose of our lives is to reveal God to men. And only where God is seen does life truly begin. We are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. And I know many of you have seen that inscribed on the just around the campus here, and that stone piece over behind by the chapel. A similar point is made by the great modern Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt. We are all the same, that is, human, all the same, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who has ever lived, lives, or will live. Beautiful phrase, isn't it? That's the one thing we have in common, is our absolute uniqueness. Literature has always gloried in this view of the human person as singular, irreplaceable, not reducible to a mere unit in a species. Of course, we do belong to a species, and we can often act in predictable ways, which the sociologists love to study. But as writers like Flaubert tell us, and as thinkers like Pope Benedict and Hannah Arendt remind us too, the striking fact about us is our singularity. Okay? Mass culture can encourage us to minimize that singularity, to blend in, to do as everybody else does, to think or not think as the prevailing mode prescribes. And the call of mass culture is a very powerful one. We need, then, serious, truthful explorations of the individual human person the kind that the great writers offer us, to break free from those deadening, reductive habits. The artists then, to use Browning's phrase, lend their minds out, allowing us to share in their unique, singular vision of the world. What do they show us about the world? Well, to begin with, they induce in us a sense of wonder, okay? A sense of apprehending the beautiful, and a desire to see and know just how all this could possibly have come to be. The things of this world point us toward their maker, don't they? And if and when we see them aright, we know, as stated in the Apostolic Constitution Dei Verbum, that God, the beginning and end of all things, can be known with certainty from created reality. And as St. Athanasius said, though we are made in the image of God, which along with revelation ought to be sufficient for us to have at least some sense of our Maker, God also, quote, provided the works of creation as a means by which the Maker might be known. This point was made even more eloquently by the great Catholic poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins. Some of you know this poem. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, charged electrically. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. Despite man's sins, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breasts and with bright wings. Okay? Well, surely this is the ultimate thing we ought to be seeing, right? When we look at the world around us, a world charged with the grandeur of God. It's a sacramental view, right? A world filled with visible signs of God's grace. The author known as the Pseudo-Dionysius tells us, quote, "The beautiful is therefore the same as the good, for everything looks to the beautiful and the good as the cause of being, and there is nothing in the world without a share of the beautiful and the good." Well, literature isn't always about what seems to be beautiful, though, is it? Especially if we think of beauty and prettiness as being the same thing. Right? That kind of prettiness is even rarer in serious literature. And in the eyes of artists like Flaubert, or even very explicitly Christian writers like Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor, the world they present to us might at first seem very dark. Literature takes us into the truths of the human heart. And these are not always, and maybe not even very often, soothing. Dana Gioia, one of our modern poets and one of the on the editorial board of our journal Logos, put it nicely. Many Christian readers want inspiring books written by exemplary individuals who depict virtuous characters overcoming life's obstacles to arrive at happy endings. These readers should avoid most Catholic literature. Yeah. And I've heard from some students sometimes in my Catholic novel class that are first taken aback by how disturbing and how unpretty Catholic literature can be. Serious literature and art, the kind that John Paul II called for in his letter to artists, must seek out truths and be unafraid in doing so. The great Catholic novelist Francois Mauriac referred to being certain of one thing: no work of fiction is of value unless it submits absolutely to its subject, which is the human heart. The writer has to advance in his knowledge of the human, to bend down and inspect all the abysses he encounters without giving in to vertigo or disgust or horror. Okay? Another way of saying this, I guess, is that the Catholic novelist, for example, must first be a good novelist, right? As John Paul II also emphasized. The demands of the art need to be met, including an unflinching exploration of the human. And if the novelist or poet or playwright takes us to disturbing places, we must remind ourselves that ultimately the true is one with the good and with the beautiful. Well, let me draw toward a conclusion by saying just a few words about two novelists who I think can stand as examples of the kind of individualized style that Flaubert was calling for, right? And who are both Catholic believers and whose works are, in fact, often rather disturbing. The idea of art as a lending the mind out is very vivid and clear with these two writers. They both move us into a dramatically different state of consciousness, a dramatically different way of seeing and relating to the world around us. I mean, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky and the American Flannery O'Connor. We hear Dostoevsky enthusiastically recommended to us again and again for the Catholic reader. Popes John Paul II, Benedict XIV, and Francis all talked extensively about Dostoevsky and how we need to read him. The singular, powerful sensibility of Dostoevsky's mature novels, especially The Brothers Karamazov, which Benedict called the greatest novel ever written, that sensibility was shaped in part by a dramatic and traumatic experience when he was about 28 years old. Some of you know about this story, but Dostoevsky had just published his first novel called Poor Folk. He had fallen in with a group of progressive thinkers, not exactly radicals, but progressive thinkers, men who hoped to see political reforms in Russia, to make Russia just a little bit more like Western Europe. But this was in 1848, 1849, a time when revolutions and uprisings were springing up all over Europe. The Russian Tsar was not going to take any chances. He rounded up groups of people, like the people Dostoevsky was involved with, had them arrested, and in their case, sentenced to death. They were all led out into a courtyard, blindfolded, ready to face the firing squad. They heard the weapons clicking. They're ready to die. And suddenly an announcement was made saying they were all going to be saved. Instead of execution, they were all going off to a Siberian prison for 10 years. Well, such an experience would certainly mark anyone, wouldn't it? And it certainly did mark Dostoevsky. He became much more deeply reflective. He rediscovered his faith. And in the prison years, and in the years after, he grew dramatically, both as an artist and as a man of faith. In fact, immediately after that stay of execution, he wrote to his brother an impassioned letter saying in part, "Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every moment could be a lifetime of happiness." When I assign Dostoevsky to American students, I hear from many of them, they're surprised at the intensity in his outlook and in his characters. It's almost too much sometimes. It seems almost a feverish intensity. As one scholar put it, Dostoevsky's characters and the man himself live in a state of eschatological apprehension. Nice phrase, eschatological apprehension, in which every instant takes on a supreme value. Every moment of the present is when a decisive choice has to be made. Often people have compared this Dostoevskian view to the way the early Christians must have felt when the belief was widespread that the end of the world was imminent and it could come any moment. How can we readers benefit from sharing or inhabiting that Dostoevskian state of consciousness, which we must if we're going to read him? Living day to day like that, I think, would be too much for most of us. It sure would be for me. But being reminded of the truth implicit in that state of mind is important. Being reminded that, yes, every moment of our lives could be our last. Every moment of our lives could be the moment we make a choice to God, to life, to love, or the opposite. And that choice, even in a seemingly small thing in the day-to-day, could end up having enormous repercussions. To read Dostoevsky deeply, to let him lend his mind out to you, is to experience, I think, a deeper gratitude and a deeper awareness of the almost incomprehensible gift that this moment is. Let me pair Dostoevsky with the American Flannery O'Connor for a somewhat similar reason. Her outlook, expressed in her characters and plots and settings, and even in the little descriptive details in her novels and stories, her outlook, like Dostoevsky's, has a certain violence about it. O'Connor's world is the American South, mostly Georgia, and mostly between about 1930 and 1960. And her style, her absolute way of seeing things, as Flaubert put it, is the grotesque. Okay? Many of you will have read her short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. I'll bet many of you have. Okay? In which an escaped convict murders an entire family. But before he does it, he has a deep and serious conversation about the meaning of the incarnation. If you've read it, you won't forget it. And such bizarre mixes, murder and theology, cruelty and grace, okay, are essential to her vision. Okay? A favorite target in her stories is the modern version of the Pharisee. Okay? The self-satisfied, outwardly moral and respectable person, but who harbors inside corruption and a lack of love. Okay? The best instance of this is in a story some of you may have read called Revelation, which I highly recommend, in which the Pharisee is a prosperous middle-aged lady named Mrs. Turpin. She and her husband find themselves in a small-town doctor's waiting room in the South. Okay? And we readers are privy to her thoughts, as she repeatedly takes delight in what a good person she is. Okay? She looks around the room, categorizing and judging everybody, okay, very quickly, and again, being thankful for the kind of good person she is. Okay? There's another woman in the waiting room, rather like Mrs. Turpin, her same age and probably the same kind of person. Okay? But this one has brought her college-age daughter along with her. The college-age daughter is reading a book, okay, as she's begins staring intently at Mrs. Turpin. And before long, Mrs. Turpin notices she seems to be staring at her with hate in her eyes. What is that girl staring at me for? What on earth is wrong with her? And abruptly, the girl picks up her big, heavy college textbook, hurls it at Mrs. Turpin, smacking her right in the head, leaps forward, grabs her around the throat, and starts saying, "Go back to hell where you came from, you warthog." Well, this is dramatic. Stop for Flannery O'Connor is never boring. The girl is finally pulled off her and sedated. Right? We learn the girl's name. It's wonderful. The girl's name is Mary Grace. That episode is pure O'Connor grotesque. Okay? The perfectly named girl and her attack suggest the violence with which grace must enter the lives of those of us who urgently need to be shaken out of our hateful complacency, like Mrs. Turpin needs. Okay? O'Connor's violent and grotesque world paints a vision of a world that's so far gone that if grace is going to operate, it's going to have to do so in bizarre and shocking ways. Yeah? When Flannery O'Connor lends her mind out to us, we have to look at the world, for a time at least, the way she does. Like her characters, we realize that we too may need to be shaken up and out of our own comfortable perspectives. Well, Dostoevsky and O'Connor are two vivid examples of this idea of lending our minds out and of being urged through spiritual, as remember that term, spiritual vision, through spiritual imaging vision, being urged into higher intellectual vision. Okay? I could point to dozens of other authors who work upon us in similar ways, from one of my favorites, the Protestant John Milton in the 17th century, to the 19th century atheist Percy Shelley, all of them performing the service of making us see. Okay? There are other ways of defending literature and other ways of describing what literature is and does, but this lending our minds out, or as John Paul said, allowing us to inhabit the writer's unique vision, seems to me to be the most essential. So, thank you. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Dr. Mackenzie will have to get a few questions. There's a microphone right there. So if anyone has a question, go right to the microphone.
Gentle softball questions are preferred.
spiritual would be the middle one,
Yeah.
and less informed one.
Mm-hmm.
And in my spiritual formation, you sort of have three, and one of them departs from intellectual and absorbs itself in the basically surrender. So I'm curious your thoughts on that relative to lending our minds out in this context. Is there something missing in that framework?
Well, I don't like to criticize Augustine, and I'm not sure that I fully understand his explanation for why he's using the word spiritual that way. Okay? One writer says he's referring to this medieval conception of a fluid in the body called the spiritus. You know, that it might have something to do with what he means here, that it's more brain-based or something like that. As I say, it's for us, it's an unfortunate choice of words, and I would rather have him call it something like imaging. But yeah, what you and I mean today by spiritual might very well be what he called intellectual. You know, we might want to just edit him a little bit, but that would require, I think, a lot of gall. Oh. I can't quite hear you. Could you? Not very well. It's my fault. I think I brought my bad ears with me.
Well, I can try to speak loudly.
Great. That'll do it.
So lending our minds out kind of has this connotation of dressing up, of playing, like child's play. Can we see literature in terms of play? What would that look like?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry to be dense here, but maybe it's the volume.
Okay, great. Okay, my question is about the relationship between literature and play. So can we see literature that way? Kind of lending our minds out kind of reminds me of like playing dress up or kids' games almost in a more sophisticated way. Yeah, what kind of relationship does literature and play have?
I think a very close relationship. When we inhabit an author, or we inhabit a character in a novel, because we identify with these characters. It's like a species of play, isn't it? I think there's a lot of comparison to be made there. And it's safe because it's within the covers of a book. You know, I don't have to go out into the street and pretend to be somebody else, but if I pick up this novel, I can imagine what it's like to be a 19th century Russian or whatever. You know? Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I rather think that even Browning would like the comparison. That there's a play in the mind in both senses of that word, both a play, a moving, okay, but also a play and a playfulness, okay, that art encourages us in us and allows us to see differently, to see through other eyes and what other lives would be like. So, yeah, I think it's a good comparison. Yeah.
Thank you. I was curious in your quote from John Paul II, you mentioned that we can sort of step into somebody else's sight without having to decide whether or not it's true.
Yes.
I was wondering if you'd comment, is there a danger in taking a viewpoint that we might know isn't true, and how can we be careful around that? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think on the one hand, when it comes to reading, reading is one of the safer places where we can do that kind of play, you know? And of course, there is such a thing, I think, as a wicked book, an evil book, and that we're better off not playing with that. But yeah, we do inhabit other kinds of characters, and we just go ahead with it to have the experience. You know? I think it broadens us a little bit inside. You know? Does that answer your question well enough? Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Dr. Mackenzie. So just a quick question and a remark from the beginning of your lecture. You referenced literature as sort of uniquely preserving the irreducibility of the human person. We started with a painting as well. And so I'm curious, is there anything about the form of literature that you think uniquely preserves the irreducibility of the human person? If so, in what way would that be different from, say, other forms of art?
Can you restate the question a little bit? I'm thinking as I'm listening to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So early on in your lecture, you referenced literature as sort of uniquely preserving the irreducibility of the human person or representing that in some way. And of course, there are different forms of art. We started with a painting. So what is it about maybe the form of literature as such that preserves the irreducibility of the human person in a way maybe other art forms might fail to?
Yeah, in answering that question, I almost feel like I'm claiming literature is superior to all the other arts, and I'm not sure I want to say that. It's certainly my favorite, but that's all. But because it happens within the mind, and it only slightly uses the senses, just enough using the eyes to run these words, and we're translating these words into mental structures and mental concepts. You know, I think it's unique in that respect. Yeah? And it can do things that a painting cannot, for example. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. So I teach a course in Changsha, China called the Classic Novel to basically high school students who do not, in their cultural mindset, do not understand why we read novels. And I use, for example, Lucy Montgomery's the Anne of Green Gables saga, because that changed adoption in the West. And I just say a classic novel is a novel that has a message for all cultures across all time, across the world. But how would I refine that for a Catholic classic novel?
Well, for one thing, if the Catholic novel is going to be good, it first has to be a good novel. And therefore, it ought to speak to every reader, or at least with allowing for taste, of course. Okay? It shouldn't exclude any reader. Okay? The difference between a good Catholic novel and a good novel will probably be found in the outlook of the author, okay? And in the possibility for spiritual reality that the author entertains, that is, usually excluded in most ordinary novels, most modern mass entertainment. The question of what makes a Catholic novel is something I fiddled with over 14 weeks in my semester, and it's a complicated question. But as that quote I put up here before from Mauriac indicates, the Catholic novelist can't just have good pious intentions and be a good novelist. You have to be a good novelist, okay, first. Okay? And John Paul pretty much says the same thing in his letter to artists. Be a good artist. Okay? You're no good being a Catholic artist if you're not a good artist. It might actually do more harm than good. Yeah. Does that help a little?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the tap back response on the iPhone?
I don't think so, no.
It's like when you're texting someone and you get a response saying they liked your message. Have you seen that before?
No, I guess not, no.
Okay. Well, I'm sure lots of the audience has, but it's a new way of, I think iPhone came out with it like 5 or 6 years ago. And basically, instead of using words to respond, you can just do a heart, a thumbs up, a thumbs down, a laugh,
Yep.
or something else.
Okay.
When it came out, I freaked out because I was like, wow, we're all going to lose our ability to communicate.
Yeah.
Kind of like the guy who wrote Madame Bovary said. So I am wondering what you think. I've gotten used to it by now. Like, I can still express myself via text and actually find it really useful. I don't think I'm a complete robot, but I think the same thing in like emailing people or just like practical language throughout the day. Yeah. I'm always like concerned whether a slogan or a cliche has use, or if like I am offending either my reader or like my own ability to see things. So I'm wondering like what use there is for this kind of communication, or if like that is specifically a critique reserved for the intellectual side.
Yeah. Within email, it happens, doesn't it? You start saying something, and it finishes a sentence for you. Yeah. So that it makes you think, gosh, I might as well be a robot. I have nothing original to say that the machine hasn't already anticipated, you know. And so I find myself trying to find some other way of saying it, and, you know, and then the recipient has no idea what I'm talking about. But yeah, that's one of those cases where we try to be individual users of the language and want the language to truly be expressing what we as individuals truly mean. And gosh, it's hard. It is hard. Yeah. Good point and question. Hi, Hannah.
Hello, Dr. Mackenzie. So I was wondering, because I know your talk focused specifically on the novel and that mode of literature. So I guess I was wondering if you could speak to what makes the novel distinct from, say, poetry?
It's a question I'd like to have more time to think about, but my first thought is that the novel, almost by definition, is a representation of the way things really are. A poem can be a representation of a fantasy, or of a feeling, or a subtle thing that's going on, or language play, but a novel should in some way point to the real world, and kind of interpret it for me, enact it for me. Okay? I think that's the essential difference, and thus the Catholic novel is probably going to be a slightly different thing than the Catholic poem, huh? That helps. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a graduate of the program from 2012, and I never got to take your course. I wish I would have been able to. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you selected the books that you did, and also what's your current reading list for your class?
Oh gosh, yeah. The current reading list is always under revision because there's always so many new things cropping up. But in the last time I did it, we started with the Brothers Karamazov, went through The Diary of a Country Priest by Bernanos, a couple of books by Mauriac, who's a favorite of mine and who I've translated, a couple of books by him. And then, of course, the British, Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, and concluding with the great Flannery O'Connor. So, is that pretty much what yeah. So many other things that if one had world enough in time, one would like to assign. But, Bob?
Thank you for your lecture. I'm sorry that it ended so quickly. You mentioned.
That sarcastic?
I'm sorry?
Was that sarcasm?
Me, sarcasm? No. No, I was serious. You mentioned Jacques Maritain. And Maritain, as you may know, wrote a number of essays about the doing of history, the writing of history. And so I'm inviting a comment from you. He said, and something you said sort of triggered this in my mind, that the good historian needs to be able to imagine himself in the situation, to place himself in the situation that he's writing about. This seems to me to be so different from the way in which history is done today, which is so very often an accumulation of facts and statistics and so on and so on. Do you think there's a parallel between Maritain's comment and the writing of good literature? Do you think we should do history that way?
I think it's a good point, yeah. I think the great historians seem to always be people who felt along with their subject, you know? I think of people like Macaulay and so on, Carlyle too. When history is lacking that, it also lacks the human dimension. It might as well just be a compilation of facts and figures. So the good historian maybe could also be discussed in terms of this lending our minds out. You know? That imaginative sympathy, imaginative identification is part of the historian's art, or should be, as it is part of the novelist's art. Good.
Literature can be very subversive, and it can make humans regress, I guess, from a Catholic perspective. Are there works that meet Flaubert's threshold of style and help us to lend our minds out, but yet aren't Catholic? And if so, is that reason that the church should consider bringing back the index or something similar?
It's a complex question. Flaubert was not a Catholic and was quite skeptical about religious belief. When he saw the real thing, he honored it. But mostly what he saw around him was hypocrisy. And he liked pointing that out. And I think he's one of the greatest novelists who ever lived because he was truest to the novelist's art. And I think for a Catholic searching for the truth about human life, that non-believing mocker, Flaubert, can actually be an excellent guide. That's a paradox, isn't it? Now, if, on the other hand, Flaubert was using his tremendous powers of expression to insist that, spiritual reality is nonsense and the believers are fools and so forth, then it gets a little different, doesn't it? And then you might think, well, maybe the index has something going for it. Something like this, But whether the writer is a believer or not sometimes doesn't matter. Mauriac, a very serious Catholic writer, tells a story that's kind of horrifying. But one of his novels, Genetrix, in part about a kind of a wicked older woman who mistreats her, I think it's her nephew, sort of emotionally abuses him, the young man. And he got a fan letter from a reader who said, "I loved your novel. It almost made me kill my grandmother." Right? And more horrified. That's not what I was writing novels for. That's not what I wanted to do. But it also shows when you put a book out there in the world, you don't know what kind of life it's going to have in the mind of its readers. And sometimes the opposite can happen. A godless book can be a real revelation to a person who sees deeply what maybe the author, him or herself, didn't see. Complicated question, in short. No simple answer for that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a question, I think flipping that historical question on its head, looking at the other side. It seems to be incredibly important to understand the truth being conveyed by a novel, to understand both the historical circumstances of the setting and of the author's time. So given that premise, what is your advice or recommendation for seeing our time through a literary lens and not being so limited to subjective experience and our text buttons and email autocomplete and stuff?
Seeing our time through a literary lens. Well, you don't mean, for example, taking a Dostoevsky novel and simply applying it to modern America, or do you?
No, I don't mean that. That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Artists are meant to be, aren't they, the interpreters of our time, the spokespeople who get down on paper or on the canvas or on the movie screen the way things were and are, and thank God for them. Beyond that, I think we have to let the work have its life, out there in the world, and see what good it does, what harm it does. Am I answering your question?
I was asking, yes, esoterically, but also practically. If I want a book that talks about today or 20 years ago or even the 1950s leading to today and the political and social circumstances we find ourselves in, looking at my own vision and the vision of other like-minded people only gets me so far without artist's vision. So I'm practically looking at, what do you read, what do you watch, what do you listen to that offers an artistic vision that allows you to see the current reality?
Thank you. Very interesting question. I'm probably an odd duck in what I'm about to say. I have never, since I was a kid and started reading, I have never especially found contemporary literature interesting. I keep feeling like, well, yeah, I know about that. You're talking about, the Beatles or something. Well, I know about the Beatles. I can watch them on TV. But take me back to 19th century France and now a world that I don't know about. So I've always been that way. Literature has always been, I felt like life was fuller and wider because literature got me out of the present And I was then able to, I hope, see the present a little more clearly. So, and other people will be different. I know I have some colleagues who teach contemporary literature and would smack me in the face for what I just said, probably. You know, there's plenty of wisdom, plenty of greatness in contemporary literature. Probably there is. But I'm a little deaf to it. You know, I hear the past more vividly.